You are listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
Alex Traiman is joining us, and of course he's with the Voice of Israel, and he's also the Jerusalem correspondent at jns.org, and he's been involved with the honordiaries.com and so many other things. Alex, first of all, thank you for joining us on such short notice, and we share your grief and sorrow with the loss of these three young men who had so much life ahead of them, and we hold hands with you and all of our brothers and sisters around the world and Israel in sharing the grief that we all feel.
Well, thank you for having me, and that's really appreciated. The entire country is in a very deep sense of mourning. The Jewish people, unlike any other people in the world, really are a family. And when one of us goes down, especially in such horrific conditions, and this time three of our family members brutally slain in the worst form of terror, kidnapping and brutal murder, the entire country feels it into the deepness of our hearts and our souls, and I'm certain that tomorrow there's going to be a very heartfelt funeral for these three boys, and so we definitely appreciate your warm wishes of condolences.
Yeah. Now, Alex, if you can, just for the listeners, to give a little sense of where all this happened, would this be north of Jerusalem in the West Bank, or is this just south of Jerusalem?
The boys were going to school near the biblical city of Hebron, which is about half an hour's drive south of Jerusalem, directly south, along Route 60, Highway 60, which is sort of the biblical highway that connects a lot of the cities that are present in the book of Genesis and throughout the Jewish Torah. They were on their way home, and they jumped into what's called the tramp in Israel, or hitchhike situation. And I know that for the listeners in the States, the hitchhikers seem like they're asking for trouble, and that's not something that would normally be advised. However, hitchhiking in Israel, and particularly in the West Bank, in the Jewish provinces of Judea and Samaria, is a regular mode of transport, as bus service is not as common as intercity. And these boys jumped into a ride. They were taken about half the distance toward Jerusalem into the Gush Etzion, a Jewish settlement block near the Jewish community of Alon Shvut, where they were then again waiting for the next tramp or hitch into their final destination. And it was there that they were picked up by two Arabs, members of the Hamas terror movement. One of them actually called to the Israeli police shortly after and whispered that he had been kidnapped. There's a major investigation took place over the last 18 days about that call, because the call was immediately dropped, and the police didn't take it seriously at first, and therefore for several hours passed before the proper authorities were alerted, and who knows if those several hours were instrumental in the fates of these three boys. In fact, 4 police officers were just dismissed from their posts today as a result of that. And as you may imagine, security is so important, and fast response is critical in situations like this. And unfortunately for the parents of these three boys and the entire Jewish people, the police really seem to have failed in this situation.
Yeah, and just something that we've always said here, the terrorists, we have to get it right 100% of the time. The terrorists only have to get it right once. And, this is a case where, there could be 100 incidents like this, and the one time that they are successful, you end up with the loss of 3 individuals. And that's why, of course, as you just mentioned, we have to have 100% security, 100% response to every type of threat that's ever brought to our attention. But I know Alex John has numerous questions for you, so we're going to bring him into the conversation.
Alex,
hey, John.
So first, I personally find it so morally reprehensible that the U.S. and the EU, among others, are essentially funding terrorism by the very nature that they continue to write checks to the PA, which is really just an organizational structure for disseminating money under the PLO, and doing so even before we had the idea that Hamas and the PLO were going to join forces, or as I like to refer to it as the terrorist family reunion. My simple summary here is that the boss's duplicity is in of itself complicity. In other words, and you know this firsthand, and this is what I wanted you to speak to, he puts on a suit and he speaks to the world press in English, and he sounds like a semi-reasonable man with a handful of gripes that you might be able to see every once in a while from his perspective. And then when he speaks to his own people, what comes out, Alex?
Well, there are many clips of Mahmoud Abbas speaking in Arabic on a site which I invite all of your listeners to go look at, which is called Palestinian Media Watch, and you can see that there is praise for terrorists, that there is incitement to violence, that there is denial of Jewish history in the state of Israel and in Jerusalem itself. So there definitely is this duplicity of message, what gets spoken out towards the foreign press and what's said in Arabic to his own people. And I think that you raise an interesting point about the marriage now between Fatah and the Hamas. And in many ways, I think for the state of Israel, this union is positive because the Hamas does not play the double-edged tongue game that Mahmoud Abbas plays. And they are very, very clear about their intentions. They do not mince their words. They do not sugarcoat their message for the international audience. And so by marrying these two parties together, we get a clear sense of what the ideology actually is. By not isolating Hamas, we understand very clearly that the Fatah also is complicit in the firing of rockets from Gaza, and there's been a major upsurge in rocket fire from Gaza in the last 2 to 3 weeks, and even as many as 16 rockets fired in the past 24 hours from Gaza, and of course into violent attacks like this kidnapping 18 days ago.
Now, while you rightfully give a tongue-in-cheek praise to Hamas for its intellectual honesty, that it at least openly calls for the destruction of Israel, there is a very troubling scenario here. Is this is coming right off the heels of the Presbyterian Church making or voting against Israel in support of terrorism. I just call it like it is, by saying that the BDS movement essentially is designed to say Israel is an apartheid state and marginalizing Israel because Israel builds a wall. But aren't these events exactly why that wall exists in the first place, Alex?
Sure. Right outside of the city of Bethlehem, which is the city of the Church of the Nativity, you see this wall. You could see it from Jerusalem, overlooking Bethlehem, and in other areas surrounding Jerusalem, and really all across. It's almost a perimeter wall around the entire West Bank, and it is exactly this wall that has cut down suicide bombings. Remember, now we're dealing with kidnappings and rockets, but it wasn't long ago that the Israeli people were suffering from suicide bombings in Israeli population centers, and that wall was instrumental in cutting down the number of suicide bombings in the country. Now, for me and for other Jews living here in Israel, we do not like the wall, because what a wall does, it essentially says, we'll be comfortable with all the land on this side of the wall, and you can have all the land on the other. And in fact, that causes facts on the ground, so to speak, and almost de facto state border, which is problematic in its own diplomatic and political way. But yes, the wall was built to prevent terror attacks on Israeli population centers, and it has succeeded in safeguarding the lives of Israeli citizens.
Yes, it succeeded in an enormous way. There was a sad irony this morning that one of the first things I saw in the Israeli press was that Benjamin Netanyahu was now calling for the idea that to prevent the radical Islamists in the form of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, who are clearly applying and very successfully applying pressure using traditional military tactics, which is relatively new for radical Islam, to put or destabilize Jordan as well as to destabilize Saudi Arabia. And so, as you know, Bibi was calling now for offense all along the Jordanian border. which is interesting to me, because having been on that border between Jordan and Israel, one of the things that makes that a terrific border to a large extent is because the plateau that separates much of Jordan from Israel is itself a natural barrier, leaving relatively few openings for tanks and traditional armies to come through. But as we know, that doesn't necessarily work when you're talking about dealing with terrorists as opposed to dealing with tank columns.
That's 100% correct. I think that there's something else interesting about the fact that now Jordan is looking to Israel for military support and dealing with Islamic threats. You know, we recently also heard calls from Syrian opposition in the past several months to be enforcing, for Israel to, in fact, enforce a no-fly zone over southern Syria. And it is incredible to see how moderate Arab Muslims in the region are now looking at Israel to safeguard stability in the region, Israel as the growing military and dominant power in the region, because quite frankly, they are starting to recognize that they cannot turn to the United States to protect order in the region. They cannot turn to Russia nor to the European Union, but rather that Israel is here to stay, and Israel is the one that can deploy its army in a way that can help safeguard not just the Jewish people, but the entire region.
Now, Al, obviously you came on the show with very short notice given the tragedy, but we're actually going to want in the very near future to get in this discussion a little deeper regarding Jordan from a couple of fronts. One will be the military side and cooperative side, as you just pointed out. The other is the fact that Jordan itself really could, if you looked at this in the most dispassionate, fair, and honest way, you can easily make the case that Jordan is Palestine from the contemporaneous use of the word Palestine or Palestinians. And we're actually hoping to have another guest on next within the coming days, Madur Zaran, who I'm not sure if you know who he is, but he's a Jordanian expatriate, more like refugee, who is very much of the opinion that the Palestinians are actually fighting their own battle of suffrage in Jordan, and they are the majority and the rightful people, and that the true divide should actually be two states side by side with the Jordan River separating them. If that was ever to be a possibility, the biggest risk to that is what's going on with ISIS at this moment. So if you want to give quick commentary on that, please do, and then I want to move back to the subject at hand.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're raising a very important point when people talk about demographic issues in the state of Israel. What people don't realize is that Palestinians make up anywhere from 70 to 75% of Jordan. They're being ruled by a minority Hashemite regime that was implanted from Saudi Arabia by the British, and they represent 20% of the population. If the king of Jordan were to fall, as we've seen many of the other long-standing dictators in the region fall, and that country went into an open election or some form of a coup, there's no doubt that the Palestinian people would find self-determination of their population majority. And when you understand that, and you understand the fragility of these leaders in the region, including very much so the King of Jordan, you understand that racing to create a Palestinian state between the Jordan and the Mediterranean, in land that is currently under Israeli sovereignty, really might not be the wisest option, and perhaps maintaining the status quo until the region settles down, until such self-determination may or may not be realized, or that is better understood. Really waiting and not rushing into doing something irreversible seems to be, to many, including this current government, to be the correct course of action.
Well, Alex, I think this is a conversation that is going to be very quickly manifested by real-time activities that are occurring on the ground, so I'm sure we'll be discussing this fairly regularly. Before I hand this back to Brett, I had a quick, looking at this almost just from an average guy on the streets mentality. How would you, as an Israeli, differentiate to people, especially some of our folks who may not pay enough attention to what's going on in the Middle East and the underlying politics, how is the tragedy of losing 3 teenage boys in a terrorist event like this, doing something, a daily routine event like traveling to and from school, different than here in America, for example, where you might lose 3 teenage boys with regularity due to a car accident or gang violence or something of that nature? What makes this uniquely different and uniquely painful and sobering as an Israeli.
Well, I mean, I think you're raising several interesting points at the same time, and you're seeing. I mean, these were schoolboys. They were basically on their way home, from their high school, and unfortunately, now in the United States, you're seeing oftentimes that distraught students or other individuals in the community are literally going into schools and opening fire, and in very similar, almost similar terroristic circumstances. But the major difference here is that those incidents are emotionally and personally motivated, in many cases of an emotional sickness, a mental sickness, which unfortunately seems to be permeating itself much more through American society than ever before. And here in Israel, when these events take place, they are nationalistically motivated. In fact, these are part of an act of war and an ideology which is really, in its essence, 100% anti-Semitic. And I think that have terror organizations here inside the land of Israel that are motivating youngsters to take actions against the Jewish people and to do it however they can. And this was just one horrific manifestation of such ideology.
Yeah, Alex, when I was preparing, I spent hours every day, all day long, actually reading different articles and preparing for the 5 programs that we do each weekday. And what I was reading about was the ISIS, which has now declared itself as a caliph, and now calling themselves the Islamic State. And then, of course, across I have the AP wire that comes across announcing the discovery of these 3 teenagers, which was just terrible news to find out. But I mentioned this with ISIS, which is now, according to them, the Islamic State, because it's the evidence of a greater problem, and a problem that we've all been discussing and reporting on for years. And that is that there are such extreme elements throughout the world, but in particular throughout the Middle East. And Israel has unfortunately had to deal with all these extreme groups, and many of which are in conflict with themselves, which is why you have the civil war in Syria. But I think here's the bigger problem, Alex, that when the world community, whether it be the United States, the West, or the UN, or other nations, when they don't properly respond and deal with situations on the ground within these countries as the extreme actions are happening, then we see what we witnessed today. And what happened in the Syrian civil war has now spread into all the neighboring countries, in particular Iraq. But now you have issues where towns are being taken over, borders are being wiped out, and to me, if the world community does not step in and deal with all forms of extremism, I mean, whether it's Hezbollah, whether it's Hamas, whether it's the PLO, or Al-Qaeda, or whatever we want to call it, it's time for the world to stop accepting them as the people who run the UN, and where the UN or other international agencies or whoever has to deal with it needs to step up and eradicate this behavior, because humanity can't exist like this.
Well, it certainly requires a will that currently doesn't exist, and I think that here in Israel we really have a microcosm of the situation which you've described, which is a global problem. You have global radical Islamic extremism fighting against and destabilizing first the region, but really announcing very clearly, as ISIS has, that Israel is the target, and that we know as well that Israel is the little Satan, and the United States is the big Satan in their eyes. But deterrence is so very important, and here in Israel, deterrence is even more important. And you may remember that we recently transferred over 1,000 terrorists back into the hands of Hamas and Fatah for the release of Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit, who was held captive for 5 years. And many people in Israel are discussing whether the release of those soldiers, of those prisoners rather, for our one soldier was actually an encouragement to Hamas to continue in the practice of trying to kidnap young individuals, hoping that perhaps they might be able to even get more terrorist prisoners out of their jail. So, how do we deal with each one of these situations? On the one hand, it's a case-by-case basis. On the other hand, if you do not establish very, very clear deterrence, then you can be, unfortunately, witness to seeing similar acts in the future.
Yeah, no, well, absolutely. And I've always felt that when Israel enters into these agreements where they have these mass release of some pretty bad people, usually in exchange for just one or just a couple, that I believe that the United States and other nations have pressured Israel into making such agreements. And I'll back that up by what we've witnessed even recently, where Barack Obama released 5 of the worst people that walked the face of the earth back to, Qatar temporarily until they go back to Afghanistan and wage war on humanity, but in exchange for Bo Bergdahl. And it's a trend that these misinformed ideologues feel makes sense. But I think you and I would agree that anytime you release a bad person into society, bad things are going to happen. And the only way to avoid that type of situation is just to lock them up.
Yeah, well, the only difference
that's about
here,
as
and
nice
I
as
think
I could say it, by the way.
Yeah, the only difference here, and I think it is important for all the listeners to understand, when you think about the Israeli mind, it's the regular Israeli man and woman on the street here, that when we have one boy, in captivity, that tears our soul apart every single day, and there isn't anything that anybody wouldn't do to get a boy like that back. And in some ways, as I mentioned earlier, at least now we have closure in this case with these 3 boys, because the country doesn't sleep at night. The little kids are saying prayers every single day. It's all people are talking about. All people care about is getting these boys back, from captivity. We can only imagine what's happening to them, when they're on the other side of enemy lines. And so while this tragedy is absolutely horrific, and in some ways this was the worst possible ending, at least now we get closure. At least we can do a proper funeral and right. Go ahead with the grieving process and regroup.
That's absolutely right. And I just want to remind our listeners, because as John and I have experienced when we've stayed in Israel at a friend's home, most private residents have what you would call a safe room, which is a special room that's prepared with special locked doors and windows and to be able to seal itself from the threat of chemical attacks or gas attacks or other types of attacks. And I think if we had to live like that in the United States, we'd have a little different perspective on how we dealt with some of these international incidents.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's part of life here and something that we've all had to get used to. At the same time, daily life on the street here is safe, and I think that's important as well. We're talking about this now in the midst of a crisis, and on CNN, of course, you see that all the bad stuff that's happening, but life in Israel on the day-to-day is relatively stable,
yes.
And especially when you look at what's going on in the rest of the region, we are a beacon of light and stability in a very, very dark region. And you know what? For the most part, Israelis are very, very happy, and they're happy to be here. And so even though we have to endure challenges that other countries literally just do not have to deal with, we are very, very to be facing those challenges here in a Jewish state on our own and being able to defend ourselves with the Jewish army.
Absolutely. Well, Alex Traiman, I offer you this opportunity to share with us your organizations or websites that you'd like to promote, and of course we will have you back on the program very soon.
Sure. For news and analysis, check out jns.org, and stay tuned for a up-and-coming English language broadcast coming live from Jerusalem called Voice of Israel. You'll be hearing about that in the weeks to come.
Excellent. Again, Alex Traiman in Israel reporting on the unfortunate discovery of the 3 teenagers and some other things going on in the region. Thank you again, my friend. Take care.
Thanks, Brother John. Thank you.